Section 33 of A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 11, Section 3, The Agency of Witches. But while this comparatively harmless doctrine of thwarting the powers of the air by fetishes and bell ringing was developed, there were evolved another theory, and a series of practices sanctioned by the Church, which must forever be considered as among the most fearful calamities in human history. Indeed, few errors have ever cost so much shedding of innocent blood over such wide territory and during so many generations. Out of the old doctrine, pagan and Christian, of evil agency in atmospheric phenomena was evolved the belief that certain men, women, and children may secure infernal aid to produce whirlwinds, hail, frosts, floods, and the like. As early as the ninth century, one great churchman, Agobard, Archbishop of Lyons, struck a heavy blow at this superstition. His work, Against the Absurd Opinion of the Vulgar touching Hail and Thunder, shows him to have been one of the most devoted apostles of right reason whom human history has known. By argument and ridicule, and at times by lofty eloquence, he attempted to breast this tide. One passage is of historical significance. He declares, "The wretched world lies now under the tyranny of foolishness. Things are believed by Christians of such absurdity as no one ever could aforetime induce the heathen to believe." Note 249. All in vain. The tide of superstition continued to roll on. Great theologians developed it and ecclesiastics favored it, until, as we near the end of the medieval period, the infallible voice of Rome is heard accepting it, and clinching this belief into the mind of Christianity. For in 1437 Pope Eugene IV, by virtue of the teaching power conferred on him by the Almighty, and under the divine guarantee against any possible error in the exercise of it, issued a bull exhorting the inquisitors of heresy and witchcraft to use greater diligence against the human agents of the Prince of Darkness, and especially against those who have the power to produce bad weather. In 1445 Pope Eugene returned again to the charge, and again issued instructions and commands infallibly committing the Church to the doctrine. But a greater than Eugene followed, and stamped the idea yet more deeply into the mind of the Church. On the 7th of December, 1484, Pope Innocent VIII sent forth his bull Summis Diserentes. Of all documents ever issued from Rome, imperial or papal, this has doubtless, first and last, cost the greatest shedding of innocent blood. Yet no document was ever more clearly dictated by conscience. Inspired by the scriptural command, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," Pope Innocent exhorted the clergy of Germany to leave no means untried to detect sorcerers, and especially those who by evil weather destroy vineyards, gardens, meadows, and growing crops. These precepts were based upon various texts of Scripture, especially upon the famous statement in the book of Job, and to carry them out, witch-finding inquisitors were authorized by the Pope to scour Europe, especially Germany, and a manual was prepared for this use, the Witch Hammer, Malleus Maleficarum. In this manual, which was revered for centuries, both in Catholic and Protestant countries, as almost divinely inspired, the doctrine of satanic agency in atmospheric phenomena was further developed, and various means of detecting and punishing it were dwelt upon. Note 250. With the application of torture to thousands of women, in accordance with the precepts laid down in the Malleus, it was not difficult to extract masses of proof for this sacred theory of meteorology. The poor creatures writhing on the rack, held in horror by those who had been nearest and dearest to them, anxious only for death to relieve their sufferings, confess to anything and everything that would satisfy the inquisitors and judges. All that was needed was that the inquisitors should ask leading questions. Note 251. And suggest satisfactory answers. The prisoners, to shorten the torture, were sure sooner or later to give the answer required, even though they knew that this would send them to the stake or scaffold. Under the doctrine of "excepted cases" there was no limit to torture for persons accused of heresy or witchcraft. Even the safeguards which the old pagan world had imposed upon torture were thus thrown down, and the prisoner must confess. The theological literature of the Middle Ages was thus enriched with numberless statements regarding modes of satanic influences on the weather. The theological literature of the Middle Ages was thus enriched with numberless statements regarding modes of satanic influence on the weather. Pathetic indeed are the records, and none more so than the confessions of these poor creatures, chiefly women and children, during hundreds of years, as to their manner of raising hailstorms and tempests. Such confessions by tens of thousands are still to be found in the judicial records of Germany, and indeed of all Europe. Typical among these is one on which great stress was laid during ages, and for which the world was first indebted to one of these poor women. Crazed by the agony of torture, she declared that, returning with a demon through the air from the witches' sabbath, she was dropped upon the earth in the confusion which resulted among the hellish legions when they heard the bells sounding the Ave Maria. It is sad to note that, after a contribution so valuable to sacred science, the poor woman was condemned to the flames. This revelation speedily ripened the belief that, whatever might be going on at the witches' sabbath, no matter how triumphant Satan might be, at the moment of sounding the consecrated bells, the satanic power was paralyzed. This theory once started, proofs came in to support it during 100 years, from the torture chambers in all parts of Europe. Throughout the later Middle Ages the Dominicans had been the main agents in extorting and promulgating these revelations, but in the centuries following the Reformation the Jesuits devoted themselves with even more keenness and vigor to the same task. Some curious questions incidentally arose. It was mooted among the orthodox authorities whether the damage done by storms should or should not be assessed upon the property of convicted witches. The theologians inclined decidedly to the affirmative, the jurists, on the whole, to the negative. Note 252. In spite of these tortures, lightning and tempests continued, and great men arose in the Church throughout Europe in every generation to point out new cruelties for the discovery of weather makers, and new methods for bringing their machinations to naught. But here and there, as early as the 16th century, we begin to see thinkers endeavoring to modify or oppose these methods. At that time Paracelsus called attention to the reverberation of cannon as explaining the rolling of thunder, but he was confronted by one of his greatest contemporaries, Jean Bodin, as superstitious in natural as he was rational in political science, made sport of the scientific theory, and declared thunder to be a flaming exhalation set in motion by evil spirits and hurled downward with a great crash and a horrible smell of sulphur. In support of this view he dwelt upon the confessions of tortured witches, upon the acknowledged agency of demons in the will o' the wisp, and specially upon the passage in the 104th Psalm, "Who maketh his angels spirits, his ministers a flaming fire." To resist such powerful arguments by such powerful men was dangerous indeed. In 1513 Pomponatius, professor at Padua, published a volume of Doubts as to the Fourth Book of Aristotle's Meteorologica, and also dared to question this power of devils, but he soon found it advisable to explain that, while as a philosopher he might doubt, yet as a Christian he, of course, believed everything taught by Mother Church, devils and all, and so escaped the fate of several others who dared to question the agency of witches in atmospheric and other disturbances. A few years later, Agrippa of Nettesheim made a somewhat similar effort to breast this theological tide in northern Europe. He had won a great reputation in various fields, but especially in natural science, as science was then understood. Seeing the folly and cruelty of the prevailing theory, he attempted to modify it, and in 1518, as Syndic of Metz, endeavored to save a poor woman on trial for witchcraft. But the chief inquisitor, backed by the sacred scriptures, the papal bull, the theological faculties, and the monks, was too strong for him. He was not only forced to give up his office, but for this and other offenses of a similar sort was imprisoned, driven from city to city and from country to country, and after his death his clerical enemies, especially the Dominicans, pursued his memory with calumny, and placed over his grave probably the most malignant epitaph ever written. As to argument, these efforts were met especially by Jean Bodin in his famous book, The Démonomanie des Sorciers, published in 1580. It was a work of great power by a man justly considered the leading thinker in France and perhaps in Europe. All the learning of the time, divine and human, he marshaled in support of the prevailing theory. With inexorable logic he showed that both the veracity of sacred Scripture and the infallibility of a long line of popes and councils of the Church were pledged to it, and in an eloquent passage this great publicist warned rulers and judges against any mercy to witches, citing the example of King Ahab, condemned by the prophet to die for having pardoned a man worthy of death, and pointing significantly to King Charles IX of France, who, having pardoned a sorcerer, died soon afterward. Note 253. In the last years of the 16th century the persecutions for witchcraft and magic were therefore especially cruel, and in the western districts of Germany the main instrument in them was Binsfeld, suffragan bishop of Treves. At that time Cornelius Loos was a professor at the university of that city. He was a devoted churchman, and one of the most brilliant opponents of Protestantism. But he finally saw through the prevailing belief regarding occult powers, and in an evil hour for himself embodied his idea in a book entitled True and False Magic. The book, though earnest, was temperate, but this helped him and his cause not at all. The texts of Scripture clearly sanctioning belief in sorcery and magic stood against him, and these had been confirmed by the infallible teachings of the Church and the popes from time immemorial. The book was stopped in the press, the manuscript confiscated, and Loos thrown into a dungeon. The inquisitors having wrought their will upon him in the spring of 1593, he was brought out of prison, forced to recant on his knees before the assembled dignitaries of the Church, and thenceforward kept constantly under surveillance and at times in prison. Even this was considered too light a punishment, and his arch enemy, the Jesuit Del Rio, declared that, but for his death by the plague, he would have been finally sent to the stake. Note 254. That this threat was not unmeaning had been seen a few years earlier in a case even more noted, and in the same city. During the last decades of the 16th century, Dietrich Flade, an eminent jurist, was rector of the University of Treves and chief judge of the electoral court, and in the latter capacity he had to pass judgment upon persons tried on the capital charge of magic and witchcraft. For a time he yielded to the long line of authorities, ecclesiastical and judicial, supporting the reality of this crime, but he at last seems to have realized that it was unreal, and that the confessions in his torture chamber of compacts with Satan, riding on broomsticks to the witch Sabbath, raising tempests, producing diseases, and the like, were either the results of madness or of willingness to confess anything and everything, and even to die, in order to shorten the fearful tortures to which the accused were in all cases subjected, until a satisfactory confession was obtained. On this conviction of the unreality of many, at least, of the charges, Flagg seems to have acted, and he at once received his reward. He was arrested by the authority of the Archbishop and charged with having sold himself to Satan, the fact of his hesitation in the persecution being perhaps suggested his guilt. He was now, in his turn, brought into the torture chamber over which he had once presided, was racked until he confessed everything which his torturers suggested, and finally, in 1589, was strangled and burnt. Of that trial a record exists in the library of Cornell University, in the shape of the original minutes of the case, and among them the depositions of Flagg, when under torture, taken down from his own lips in the torture chamber. In these depositions this revered and venerable scholar and jurist acknowledged the truth of every absurd charge brought against him, anything, everything, which would end the fearful torture. Compared with that, death was nothing. Note 255. Nor was even a priest secure who ventured to reveal the unreality of magic. When Friedrich Spee, the Jesuit poet of Western Germany, found, in taking the confessions of those about to be executed for magic, that, without exception, just when about to enter eternity and utterly beyond hope of pardon, they all retracted their confessions made under torture, his sympathies as a man rose above his loyalty to his order, and he published his Cautio Criminalis as a warning, stating with entire moderation the facts he had observed and the necessity of care. But he did not dare publish it under his own name, nor did he even dare publish it in a Catholic town. He gave it to the world anonymously, and in order to prevent any tracing of the work to him through the confessional, he secretly caused it to be published in the Protestant town of Ringteld. Nor was this all. Nothing shows so thoroughly the hold that this belief in magic had obtained as the conduct of Spee's powerful friend and contemporary, John Philipp von Schönborn, later the Elector and Prince Archbishop of Mayence. As a youth, Schönborn had loved and admired Spee, and had especially noted his persistent melancholy and his hair whitened even in his young manhood. On Schönborn's pressing him for the cause, Spee at last confessed that his sadness, whitened hair, and premature old age were due to his recollections of the scores of men and women and children whom he had been obliged to see tortured and sent to the scaffold and stake for magic and witchcraft, when he, as their father confessor, positively knew them to be innocent. The result was that when Schönborn became Elector and Archbishop of Mayence, he stopped the witch persecutions in that province and prevented them as long as he lived. But here was shown the strength of theological and ecclesiastical traditions and precedents. Even a man so strong by family connections and enjoying such great temporal and spiritual power as Schönborn dared not openly give his reasons for this change of policy. So far as is known, he never uttered a word publicly against the reality of magic, and under his successor in the electorate witch trials were resumed. The great upholders of the orthodox view retained full possession of the field. The victorious Bishop Binsfeld of Treves wrote a book to prove that everything confessed by the witches under torture, especially the raising of storms and the general controlling of the weather, was worthy of belief, and this book became throughout Europe a standard authority, both among Catholics and Protestants. Even more inflexible was Remigius, criminal judge in Lorraine. On the title page of his manual he boasts that within 15 years he had sent 900 persons to death for this imaginary crime. Note 256. Protestantism fell into the superstition as fully as Catholicism. In the same century, John Weir, a disciple of Agrippa, tried to frame a pious theory which, while satisfying orthodoxy, should do something to check the frightful cruelties around him. In his book De Praestigis Daemonum, published in 1563, He proclaimed his belief in witchcraft, but suggested that the compacts with Satan, journeys through the air on broomsticks, bearing children to Satan, raising storms and producing diseases, to which so many women and children confessed under torture, were delusions suggested and propagated by Satan himself, and that the persons charged with witchcraft were therefore to be considered as possessed, that is, rather as sinned against than sinning. Note 257. But neither Catholics nor Protestants would listen for a moment to any such suggestion. Weyer was bitterly denounced and persecuted. Nor did Becker, a Protestant divine in Holland, fare any better in the following century. For his World Bewitched, in which he ventured not only to question the devil's power over the weather, but to deny his bodily existence altogether, he was solemnly tried by the synod of his church and expelled from his pulpit, while his views were condemned as heresy, and overwhelmed with a flood of refutations whose mere catalogue would fill pages, and these cases were typical of many. The Reformation had indeed at first deepened the superstition, the new church being anxious to show itself equally orthodox and zealous with the old. During the century following the first great movement, the eminent Lutheran jurist and theologian Benedict Cartzow, whose boast was that he had read the Bible 53 times, especially distinguished himself by his skill in demonstrating the reality of witchcraft and by his cruelty in detecting and punishing it. The torture chambers were set at work more vigorously than ever, and a long line of theological jurists followed to maintain the system and to extend it. To argue against it, or even doubt it, was exceedingly dangerous. Even as late as the beginning of the 18th century, when Christian Thomasius, the greatest and bravest German between Luther and Lessing, began the efforts which put an end to it in Protestant Germany, he did not dare at first, bold as he was, to attack it in his own name, but presented his views as the university thesis of an irresponsible student. Note 258. The same stubborn resistance to the gradual encroachment of the scientific spirit upon the orthodox doctrine of witchcraft was seen in Great Britain. Typical as to the attitude both of Scotch and English Protestants were the theory and practice of King James I, himself the author of a book on demonology, and nothing if not a theologian. As to theory, his treatise on demonology supported the worst features of the superstition. As to practice, he ordered the learned and acute work of Reginald Scott, the Discoverie of Witchcraft, one of the best treatises ever written on the subject, to be burned by the hangman, and he applied his own knowledge to investigating the causes of the tempests which beset his bride on her voyage from Denmark. Skillful use of unlimited torture soon brought these causes to light. Dr. Fian, while his legs were crushed in the boots and wedges were driven under his fingernails, confessed that several hundred witches had gone to sea in a sieve from the port of Leith, and had raised storms and tempests to drive back the princess. With the coming in of the Puritans, the persecution was even more largely, systematically, and cruelly developed. The great witch finder Matthew Hopkins, having gone through the country of Suffolk and tested multitudes of poor old women by piercing them with pins and needles, declared that county to be infested with witches. Thereupon Parliament issued a commission, and sent 2 eminent Presbyterian divines to accompany it, with the result that in that county alone 60 persons were hanged for witchcraft in a single year. In Scotland matters were even worse. The auto da fe of Spain was celebrated in Scotland under another name, and with Presbyterian ministers instead of Roman Catholic priests as the main attendants. At Leith in 1664 9 women were burned together. Condemnations and punishments of women in batches were not uncommon. Torture was used far more freely than in England, both in detecting witches and in punishing them. The natural argument developed in hundreds of pulpits was this: if the all-wise God punishes his creatures with tortures infinite in cruelty and duration, why should not his ministers, as far as they can, imitate him? The strongest minds in both branches of the Protestant Church in Great Britain devoted themselves to maintaining the superstition. The newer scientific modes of thought, and especially the new ideas regarding the heavens, revealed first by Copernicus and Galileo, and later by Newton, Huygens, and Halley, were gradually dissipating the whole domain of the prince of the power of the earth, but from first to last a long line of eminent divines, Anglican and Calvinistic, strove to resist the new thought. On the Anglican side, in the 17th century, Mere Casaubon, Doctor of Divinity and a high dignitary of Canterbury; Henry More, in many respects the most eminent scholar in the Church; Cudworth, by far the most eminent philosopher; and Dr. Joseph Glanville, the most cogent of all writers in favor of witchcraft, supported the orthodox superstition in treatises of great power; and Sir Matthew Hale, the greatest jurist of the period, condemning two women to be burned for witchcraft, declared that he based his judgment on the direct testimony of Holy Scripture. On the Calvinistic side were the great names of Richard Baxter, who applauded some of the worst cruelties in England, and of Increase and Cotton Mather, who stimulated the worst in America; and these marshaled in behalf of his cruel superstition a long line of eminent divines, the most earnest of all, perhaps, being John Wesley. Nor was the Lutheran Church in Sweden and the other Scandinavian countries behind its sister churches, either in persecuting witchcraft or in repressing doubts regarding the doctrine which supported it. But in spite of all these great authorities in every land, in spite of such summary punishments as those of Flad, Loos, and Becker, and in spite of the virtual exclusion from church preferment of all who doubted the old doctrine, the new scientific view of the heavens was developed more and more. The physical sciences were more and more cultivated. The new scientific atmosphere in general more and more prevailed, and at the end of the 17th century this vast growth of superstition began to wither and droop. Montaigne, Bayle, and Voltaire in France, Thomasius in Germany, Calef in New England, and Beccaria in Italy, did much also to create an intellectual and moral atmosphere fatal to it. And here it should be stated, to the honor of the Church of England, that several of her divines showed great courage in opposing the dominant doctrine, such men as Harsnet, Archbishop of York, and Morton, Bishop of Lichfield, who threw all their influence against witch-finding cruelties, even early in the 17th century, deserve lasting gratitude. But especially should honor be paid to the younger men in the Church who wrote at length against the whole system, such men as Wagstaff and Webster and Hutchinson, who in the humbler ranks of the clergy stood manfully for truth, with the certainty that by so doing they were making their own promotion impossible. By the beginning of the 18th century the doctrine was evidently dying out. Where torture had been abolished, or even made milder, weather makers no longer confessed, and the fundamental proofs in which the system was rooted were evidently slipping away. Even the great theologian Fromundus, at the University of Louvain, the oracle of his age, who had demonstrated the futility of the Copernican theory, had foreseen this and made the inevitable attempt at compromise, declaring that devils, though often, are not always, or even for the most part, the causes of thunder. The learned Jesuit Caspar Schott, whose Physica Curiosa was one of the most popular books of the 17th century, also ventured to make the same mild statement, but even such concessions by such great champions of orthodoxy did not prevent frantic efforts in various quarters to bring the world back under the old dogma. As late as 1743 there was published in Catholic Germany a manual by Father Vincent of Berg, in which the superstition was taught to its fullest extent, with the declaration that it was issued for the use of priests under the express sanction of the theological professors of the University of Cologne, and 25 years later, in 1768, we find in Protestant England John Wesley standing firmly for witchcraft, and uttering his famous declaration, "The giving up of witchcraft is in effect the giving up of the Bible." The latest notable demonstration in Scotland was made as late as 1773, when "the divines of the Associated Presbytery" passed a resolution declaring their belief in witchcraft, and deploring the general skepticism regarding it. Note 259. End of Chapter 11, Section 3, The Agency of Witches. Section 34 of A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 11, Section 4, Franklin's Lightning Rod. But in the midst of these efforts by Catholics like Father Vincent and by Protestants like John Wesley to save the old sacred theory, it received its death blow. In 1752 Franklin made his experiments with the kite on the banks of the Schuylkill, and at the moment when he drew the electric spark from the cloud, the whole tremendous fabric of theological meteorology reared by the Fathers, the Popes, the medieval doctors, and the long line of great theologians, Catholic and Protestant, collapsed. The prince of the power of the air tumbled from his seat. The great doctrine which had so long afflicted the earth was prostrated forever. The experiment of Franklin was repeated in various parts of Europe, but at first the Church seemed careful to take no notice of it. The old Church formulas against the prince of the power of the air were still used, but the theological theory, especially in the Protestant Church, began to grow milder. 4 years after Franklin's discovery, Pastor Carl Kochen, member of the consistory and official preacher to the city council of Hildesheim, was moved by a great hailstorm to preach and publish a sermon on the revelation of God in weather. Of the prince of the power of the air he says nothing. The theory of diabolical agency he throws overboard altogether. His whole attempt is to save the older and more harmless theory that the storm is the voice of God. He insists that since Christ told Nicodemus that men know not whence the wind cometh, it can not be of mere natural origin, but is sent directly by God himself, as David intimates in the Psalm, out of his secret places. As to the hailstorm, he lays great stress upon the plague of hail sent by the Almighty upon Egypt, and clinches all by insisting that God showed at Mount Sinai his purpose to startle the body before impressing the conscience. While the theory of diabolical agency in storms was thus drooping and dying, very shrewd efforts were made at compromise. The first of these attempts we have already noted, in the effort to explain the efficacy of bells in storms by their simple use in stirring the faithful to prayer, and in the concession made by sundry theologians, and even by the great Lord Bacon himself, that church bells might, under the sanction of Providence, disperse storms by agitating the air. This gained ground somewhat, though it was resisted by one eminent church authority, who answered shrewdly that in that case cannon would be even more pious instruments. Still another argument used in trying to save this part of the theological theory was that the bells were consecrated instruments for this purpose, like the horns at whose blowing the walls of Jericho fell. Note 260. But these compromises were of little avail. In 1766 Father Stürzinger attacked the very groundwork of the whole diabolical theory. He was, of course, bitterly assailed, insulted, and hated, but the Church thought it best not to condemn him. More and more the prince of the power of the air retreated before the lightning rod of Franklin. The older Church, while clinging to the old theory, was finally obliged to confess the supremacy of Franklin's theory practically. for his lightning rod did what exorcisms and holy water and processions and the Agnus Dei and the ringing of church bells and the rack and the burning of witches had failed to do. This was clearly seen, even by the poorest peasants in eastern France, when they observed that the grand spire of Strasbourg Cathedral, which neither the sacredness of the place, nor the bells within it, nor the holy water and relics beneath it could protect from frequent injuries by lightning, was once and for all protected by Franklin's rod. Then came into the minds of multitudes the answer to the question which had so long exercised the leading theologians of Europe and America, namely, why should the Almighty strike his own consecrated temples, or suffer Satan to strike them? Yet even this practical solution of the question was not received without opposition. In America the earthquake of 1755 was widely ascribed, especially in Massachusetts, to Franklin's rod. The Reverend Thomas Prince, pastor of the Old South Church, published a sermon on the subject, and in the appendix expressed the opinion that the frequency of earthquakes may be due to the erection of iron points invented by the sagacious Mr. Franklin. He goes on to argue that in Boston are more erected than anywhere else in New England, and Boston seems to be more dreadfully shaken. Oh, there is no getting out of the mighty hand of God. 3 years later, John Adams, speaking of a conversation with Arbuthnot, a Boston physician, says, "He began to prate upon the presumption of philosophy in erecting iron rods to draw the lightning from the clouds. He railed and foamed against the points and the presumption that erected them. He talked of presuming upon God, as Peter attempted to walk upon the water, and of attempting to control the artillery of heaven." As late as 1770, religious scruples regarding lightning rods were still felt, the theory being that as thunder and lightning were tokens of the divine displeasure, it was impiety to prevent their doing their full work. Fortunately, Professor John Winthrop of Harvard showed himself wise in this, as in so many other things. In a lecture on earthquakes he opposed the dominant theology, and as to arguments against Franklin's rods, he declared, "It is as much our duty to secure ourselves against the effects of lightning as against those of rain, snow, and wind by the means God has put into our hands." Still, for some years theological sentiment had to be regarded carefully. In Philadelphia a popular lecturer on science for some time after Franklin's discovery thought it best in advertising his lectures to explain that the erection of lightning rods is not chargeable with presumption nor inconsistent with any of the principles either of natural or revealed religion. Note 261. In England the first lightning conductor upon a church was not put up until 1762, 10 years after Franklin's discovery. The spire of St. Bride's Church in London was greatly injured by lightning in 1750, and in 1764 a storm so wrecked its masonry that it had to be mainly rebuilt. Yet for years after this the authorities refused to attach a lightning rod. The Protestant Cathedral of St. Paul's in London was not protected until 16 years after Franklin's discovery, and the tower of the great Protestant church at Hamburg not until a year later still. As late as 1783 it was declared in Germany, on excellent authority, that within a space of 33 years nearly 400 towers had been damaged and 120 bell ringers killed. In Roman Catholic countries a similar prejudice was shown, and its cost at times was heavy. In Austria the church of Rosenberg, in the mountains of Carinthia, was struck so frequently and with such loss of life that the peasants feared at last to attend service. 3 times was the spire rebuilt, and it was not until 1778, 26 years after Franklin's discovery, that the authorities permitted a rod to be attached. Then all trouble ceased. A typical case in Italy was that of the Tower of St. Mark's at Venice. In spite of the angel at its summit, and the bells consecrated to ward off the powers of the air, and the relics in the cathedral hard by, and the processions in the adjacent square, the tower was frequently injured and even ruined by lightning. In 1388 it was badly shattered. In 1417 and again in 1489 the wooden spire surmounting it was utterly consumed. It was again greatly injured in 1548, 1565, 1653, and in 1745 was struck so powerfully that the whole tower, which had been rebuilt of stone and brick, was shattered in 37 places. Although the invention of Franklin had been introduced into Italy by the physician Beccaria, the Tower of St. Mark's still went unprotected, and was again badly struck in 1761 and 1762, and not until 1766, 14 years after Franklin's discovery, was a lightning rod placed upon it, and it has never been struck since. Note 262. So, too, though the beautiful tower of the Cathedral of Siena, protected by all possible theological means, had been struck again and again, much opposing was shown to placing upon it what was generally known as the heretical rock. But the tower was at last protected by Franklin's invention, and in 1777, though a very heavy bolt passed down the rod, the church received not the slightest injury. This served to reconcile theology and science so far as that city was concerned, but the case which did most to convert the Italian theologians to the scientific view was that of the church of San Nazaro at Brescia. The Republic of Venice had stored in the vaults of this church over 200,000 pounds of powder. In 1767, 17 years after Franklin's discovery, no rod having been placed upon it, it was struck by lightning. The powder in the vaults was exploded, 1/6 of the entire city destroyed, and over 3,000 lives were lost. Note 263. Such examples as these in all parts of Europe had their effect. The formulas for conjuring off storms, for consecrating bells to ward off lightning and tempests, and for putting to flight the powers of the air, were still allowed to stand in the liturgies, but the lightning rod, the barometer, and the thermometer carried the day. A vigorous line of investigators succeeding Franklin completed his victory. The traveler in remote districts of Europe still hears the church bells ringing during tempests. The Polish or Italian peasant is still persuaded to pay fees for sounding bells to keep off hailstorms. But the universal tendency favors more and more the use of the lightning rod, and of the insurance offices where men can be relieved of the ruinous results of meteorological disturbances, in accordance with the scientific laws of average, based upon the ascertained recurrence of storms. So, too, though many a poor seaman trusts to his charm that has been bathed in holy water, or that has touched some relic, the tendency among mariners is to value more and more those warnings which are sent far and wide each day over the earth and under the sea by the electric wires, in accordance with laws ascertained by observation. Yet even in our own time attempts to revive the old theological doctrine of meteorology have not been wanting. Two of these, one in a Roman Catholic and another in a Protestant country, will serve as types of many to show how completely scientific truth has saturated and permeated minds supposed to be entirely surrendered to the theological view. The island of Saint Honorat, just off the southern coast of France, is deservedly one of the places most venerated in Christendom. The monastery of Lerins, founded there in the 4th century, became a mother of similar institutions in Western Europe, and a center of religious teaching for the Christian world. In its atmosphere legends and myths grew in beauty and luxuriance. Here, as the chroniclers tell us, at the touch of Saint Honorat burst forth a stream of living water, which a recent historian of the monastery declares a greater miracle than that of Moses. Here he destroyed, with a single touch of his staff, the reptiles which infested the island, and then forced the sea to wash away their foul remains. Here, to please his sister, Sainte Marguerite, a cherry tree burst into full bloom every month. Here he threw his cloak upon the waters, and it became a raft, which bore him safely to visit the neighboring island. Here St. Patrick received from St. Just the staff with which he imitated St. Honorat by driving all reptiles from Ireland. Pillaged by Saracens and pirates, the island was made all the more precious by the blood of Christian martyrs. Popes and kings made pilgrimages to it. Saints, confessors, and bishops went forth from it into all Europe. In one of its cells St. Vincent of Lerins wrote that famous definition of pure religion which, for nearly 1,500 years, has virtually superseded that of St. James. Naturally, the monastery became most illustrious, and its seat, the Mediterranean Isle of Saints. But towards the close of the last century, its inmates having become slothful and corrupt, it was dismantled, all save a small portion torn down, and the island became the property first of impiety, embodied in a French actress, and finally of heresy, embodied in an English clergyman. Bought back for the church by the Bishop of Fréjus in 1859, there was little revival of life for 12 years. Then came the reaction, religious and political, after the humiliation of France and the Vatican by Germany, and of this reaction the monastery of St. Honorat was made one of the most striking outward and visible signs. Pius IX interested himself directly in it, called into it a body of Cistercian monks, and it became the chief seat of their order in France. To restore its sacredness the strict system of La Trappe was established: labor, silence, meditation on death. The word thus given from Rome was seconded in France by cardinals, archbishops, and all churchmen especially anxious for promotion in this world or salvation in the next. Worn out dukes and duchesses of the Faubourg Saint Germain united in this enterprise of pious reaction with the frivolous youngsters, the petites crèves, who haunt the pourlieux of Notre Dame de Lorette. The great church of the monastery was handsomely rebuilt and a multitude of altars erected, and beautiful frescoes and stained windows came from the leaders of the reaction. The whole effect was, perhaps, somewhat theatrical and thin, but it showed none the less the earnestness in making the old Isle of Saints a protest against the hated modern world. As if to bid defiance still further to modern liberalism, great store of relics was sent in, among these pieces of the true cross, of the white and purple robes, of the crown of thorns, sponge, lance, and winding sheet of Christ, the hair, robe, veil, and girdle of the Blessed Virgin, relics of St. John the Baptist, St. Joseph, St. Mary Magdalene, St. Paul, St. Barnabas, the four evangelists, and a multitude of other saints, so many that the bare mention of these treasures requires 24 distinct heads in the official catalogue recently published at the monastery. Besides all this, what was considered even more powerful in warding off harm from the revived monastery, the bones of Christian martyrs were brought from the Roman catacombs and laid beneath the altars. Note 264. All was thus conformed to the medieval view. Nothing was to be left which could remind one of the 19th century. The ages of faith were to be restored in their simplicity. Pope Leo XIII commended to the brethren the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas as their one great object of study, and works published at the monastery dwelt upon the miracles of St. Honorat as the most precious refutation of modern science. High in the cupola, above the altars and relics, were placed the bells, sent by pious donors. They were solemnly baptized and consecrated in 1871, 4 bishops officiating. a multitude of the faithful being present from all parts of Europe, and the sponsors of the great tenor bell being the Bourbon claimant to the ducal throne of Parma and his duchess. The good bishop who baptized the bells consecrated them with a formula announcing their efficacy in driving away "the prince of the power of the air" and the lightning and tempests he provokes. And then, above all, at the summit of the central spire, high above relics, altars, and bells, was placed a lightning rod. Note 265. The account of the monastery, published under the direction of the present worthy abbot, more than hints at the saving, by its bells, of a ship which was wrecked a few years since on that coast. And yet, to protect the bells and church and monks and relics from the very foe whom, in the medieval faith, all these were thought most powerful to drive away, recourse was had to the scientific discovery of that arch infidel, Benjamin Franklin. Perhaps the most striking recent example in Protestant lands of this change from the old to the new occurred not long since in one of the great Pacific dependencies of the British Crown. At a time of severe drought an appeal was made to the bishop, Dr. Moorhouse, to order public prayers for rain. The bishop refused, advising the petitioners for the future to take better care of their water supply, virtually telling them, "Heaven helps those who help themselves." But most noteworthy in this matter was it that the English government, not long after, scanning the horizon to find some man to take up the good work laid down by the lamented Bishop Fraser of Manchester, chose Dr. Moorhouse, and his utterance upon meteorology, which a few generations since would have been regarded by the whole church as blasphemy, was universally alluded to as an example of strong good sense, proving him especially fit for one of the most important bishoprics in England. Throughout Christendom the prevalence of the conviction that meteorology is obedient to laws is more and more evident. In cities especially, where men are accustomed each day to see posted in public places charts which show the storms moving over various parts of the country, and to read in the morning papers scientific prophecies as to the weather, the old view can hardly be very influential. Significant of this was the feeling of the American people during the fearful droughts a few years since in the states west of the Missouri. No days were appointed for fasting and prayer to bring rain. There was no attribution of the calamity to the wrath of God or the malice of Satan. But much was said regarding the folly of our people in allowing the upper regions of their vast rivers to be denuded of forests, thus subjecting the states below to alternations of drought and deluge. Partly as a result of this, a beginning has been made of teaching forest culture in many schools, tree planting societies have been formed, and Arbor Day is recognized in several of the states. A true and noble theology can hardly fail to recognize, in the love of nature and care for our fellow men thus promoted, something far better, both from a religious and a moral point of view, than any efforts to win the divine favor by flattery or to avert satanic malice by fetishism. End of Chapter 11, Section 4, Franklin's Lightning Rod. Section 35 of A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 12, From Magic to Chemistry and Physics. Section 1. In all the earliest developments of human thought we find a strong tendency to ascribe mysterious powers over nature to men and women especially gifted or skilled. Survivals of this view are found to this day among savages and barbarians left behind in the evolution of civilization, and especially is this the case among the tribes of Australia, Africa, and the Pacific coast of America. Even in the most enlightened nations still appear popular beliefs, observances, or sayings drawn from this earlier phase of thought. between the prehistoric savage developing this theory, and therefore endeavoring to deal with the powers of nature by magic, and the modern man who has outgrown it, appears a long line of nations struggling upward through it. As the hieroglyphs, cuneiform inscriptions, and various other records of antiquity are read, the development of this belief can be studied in Egypt, India, Babylonia, Assyria, Persia, and Phoenicia. From these civilizations it came into the early thought of Greece and Rome, but especially into the Jewish and Christian sacred books. Both in the Old Testament and in the New we find magic, witchcraft, and soothsaying constantly referred to as realities. Note 266. The first distinct impulse toward a higher view of research into natural laws was given by the philosophers of Greece. It is true that philosophical opposition to physical research was at times strong, and that even a great thinker like Socrates considered certain physical investigations as impious intrusion into the works of the gods. It is also true that Plato and Aristotle, while bringing their thoughts to bear upon the world with great beauty and force, did much to draw mankind away from those methods which in modern times have produced the best results. Plato developed a world in which the physical sciences had little if any real reason for existing. Aristotle, a world in which the same sciences were developed largely indeed by observation of what is, but still more by speculation on what ought to be. From the former of these two great men came into Christian theology many germs of medieval magic, and from the latter sundry modes of reasoning which aided in the evolution of these. Yet the impulse to human thought given by these great masters was of inestimable value to our race, and one legacy from them was especially precious: the idea that a science of nature is possible, and that the highest occupation of man is the discovery of its laws. Still another gift from them was greatest of all, for they gave scientific freedom. They laid no interdict upon new paths. They interposed no barriers to the extension of knowledge. They threatened no doom in this life or in the next against investigators on new lines. They left the world free to seek any new methods and to follow any new paths which thinking men could find. This legacy of belief in science, of respect for scientific pursuits, and of freedom in scientific research was especially received by the school of Alexandria, and above all by Archimedes, who began, just before the Christian era, to open new paths through the great field of the inductive sciences by observation, comparison, and experiment. Note 267. The establishment of Christianity, beginning a new evolution of theology, arrested the normal development of the physical sciences for over 1,500 years. The cause of this arrest was twofold. First, there was created an atmosphere in which the germs of physical science could hardly grow, an atmosphere in which all seeking in nature for truth as truth was regarded as futile. The general belief derived from the New Testament Scriptures was that the end of the world was at hand, that the last judgment was approaching, that all existing physical nature was soon to be destroyed. Hence the greatest thinkers in the Church generally poured contempt upon all investigators into a science of nature, and insisted that everything except the saving of souls was folly. This belief appears frequently through the entire period of the Middle Ages, but during the first 1,000 years it is clearly dominant. From Lactantius and Eusebius in the 3rd century, pouring contempt, as we have seen, over studies in astronomy, to Peter Damian, the noted chancellor, to Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century, declaring all worldly sciences to be absurdities and fooleries, it becomes a very important element in the atmosphere of thought. Note 268. Then, too, there was established a standard to which all science which did struggle up through this atmosphere must be made to conform, a standard which favored magic rather than science, for it was a standard of rigid dogmatism obtained from literal readings in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. The most careful inductions from ascertained facts were regarded as wretchedly fallible when compared with any view of nature whatever given or even hinted at in any poem, chronicle, code, apologue, myth, legend, allegory, letter, or discourse of any sort which had happened to be preserved in the literature which had come to be held as sacred. For 12 centuries, then, the physical sciences were thus discouraged or perverted by the dominant orthodoxy. Whoever studied nature studied it either openly to find illustrations of the sacred text, useful in the saving of souls, or secretly to gain the aid of occult powers, useful in securing personal advantage. Great men like Bede, Isidore of Seville, and Rabanus Maurus accepted the scriptural standard of science and used it as a means of Christian edification. The views of Bede and Isidore on kindred subjects have been shown in former chapters, and typical of the view taken by Rabanus is the fact that in his great work on the universe there are only 2 chapters which seem directly or indirectly to recognize even the beginnings of a real philosophy of nature. A multitude of less known men found warrant in Scripture for magic applied to less worthy purposes. Note 269. But after the 1,000 years had passed to which various thinkers in the Church, upon supposed scriptural warrant, had lengthened out the term of the earth's existence, the end of all things seemed further off than ever, and in the 12th and 13th centuries, owing to causes which need not be dwelt upon here, came a great revival of thought, so that the forces of theology and of science seemed arrayed for a contest. On one side came a revival of religious fervor, and to this day the works of the cathedral builders mark its depth and strength. On the other side came a new spirit of inquiry, incarnate in a line of powerful thinkers. First among these was Albert of Bolstad, better known as Albert the Great, the most renowned scholar of his time. Fettered though he was by the methods sanctioned in the Church, dark as was all about him, he had conceived better methods and aims. His eye pierced the mists of scholasticism. He saw the light, and sought to draw the world toward it. He stands among the great pioneers of physical and natural science. He aided in giving foundations to botany and chemistry. He rose above his time and struck a heavy blow at those who opposed the possibility of human life on opposite sides of the earth. He noted the influence of mountains, seas, and forests upon races and products, so that Humboldt justly finds in his works the germs of physical geography as a comprehensive science. But the old system of deducing scientific truth from scriptural texts was renewed in the development of scholastic theology, and ecclesiastical power, acting through thousands of subtle channels, was made to aid this development. The old idea of the futility of physical science and of the vast superiority of theology was revived. Though Albert's main effort was to Christianize science, he was dealt with by the authorities of the Dominican order, subjected to suspicion and indignity, and only escaped persecution for sorcery by yielding to the ecclesiastical spirit of the time and working finally in theological channels by scholastic methods. It was a vast loss to the earth, and certainly of all organizations that have reason to lament the pressure of ecclesiasticism which turned Albert the Great from natural philosophy to theology, foremost of all in regret should be the Christian Church, and especially the Roman branch of it. Had there been evolved in the Church during the 13th century a faith strong enough to accept the truths in natural science which Albert and his compeers could have given, and to have encouraged their growth, this faith and this encouragement would to this day have formed the greatest argument for proving the Church directly under divine guidance. They would have been among the brightest jewels in her crown. The loss to the Church by this want of faith and courage has proved in the long run even greater than the loss to science. Note 270. The next great man of that age whom the theological and ecclesiastical forces of the time turned from the right path was Vincent of Beauvais. During the first half of the 12th century he devoted himself to the study of nature in several of her most interesting fields. To astronomy, botany, and zoology he gave special attention, but in a larger way he made a general study of the universe, and in a series of treatises undertook to reveal the whole field of science. But his work simply became a vast commentary on the account of creation given in the book of Genesis. Beginning with the work of the Trinity at the creation, he goes on to detail the work of angels in all their fields, and makes excursions into every part of creation, visible and invisible, but always with the most complete subordination of his thought to the literal statements of Scripture. Could he have taken the path of experimental research, the world would have been enriched with most precious discoveries. But the force which had given wrong direction to Albert of Bolstad, backed as it was by the whole ecclesiastical power of his time, was too strong, and in all the life labor of Vincent nothing appears of any permanent value. He reared a structure which the adaptation of facts to literal interpretations of Scripture and the application of theological subtleties to nature combined to make one of the most striking monuments of human error. Note 271. But the theological spirit of the 13th century gained its greatest victory in the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. In him was the theological spirit of his age incarnate. Although he yielded somewhat, at one period, to love of natural science, it was he who finally made that great treaty, or compromise, which for ages subjected science entirely to theology. He it was who reared the most enduring barrier against those who in that age and in succeeding ages labored to open for science the path by its own methods toward its own ends. He had been the pupil of Albert the Great, and had gained much from him. Through the earlier systems of philosophy, as they were then known, and through the earlier theologic thought, he had gone with great labor and vigor, and all his mighty powers, thus disciplined and cultured, he brought to bear in making a truce which was to give theology permanent supremacy over science. The experimental method had already been practically initiated. Albert of Bolstad and Roger Bacon had begun their work in accordance with its methods. But St. Thomas gave all his thoughts to bringing science again under the sway of theological methods and ecclesiastical control. In his commentary on Aristotle's treatise upon heaven and earth, he gave to the world a striking example of what his method could produce, illustrating all the evils which arise in combining theological reasoning and literal interpretation of Scripture with scientific facts. And this work remains to this day a monument of scientific genius perverted by theology. Note 272. The ecclesiastical power of the time hailed him as a deliverer. It was claimed that miracles were vouchsafed, proving that the blessing of heaven rested upon his labors, and among the legends embodying this claim is that given by the Bollandists and immortalized by a renowned painter. The great philosopher and saint is represented in the habit of his order, with book and pen in hand, kneeling before the image of Christ crucified. And as he kneels, the image thus addresses him: "Thomas, thou hast written well concerning me. What price wilt thou receive for thy labor?" The myth-making faculty of the people at large was also brought into play. According to a widespread and circumstantial legend, Albert, by magical means, created an android, an artificial man, living, speaking, and answering all questions with such subtlety that St. Thomas, unable to answer its reasoning, broke it to pieces with his staff. Historians of the Roman Church like Rohrbacher and historians of science like Pouchet have found it convenient to propitiate the Church by dilating upon the glories of St. Thomas Aquinas in thus making an alliance between religious and scientific thought, and laying the foundations for a sanctified science. But the unprejudiced historian can not indulge in this enthusiastic view. The results, both for the Church and for science, have been most unfortunate. It was a wretched delay in the evolution of fruitful thought, for the first result of this great man's great compromise was to close for ages that path in science which above all others leads to discoveries of value, the experimental method, and to reopen that old path of mixed theology and science which, as Hallam declares, after 300 or 400 years had not untied a single knot or added one unequivocal truth to the domain of philosophy, the path which, as all modern history proves, has ever since led only to delusion and evil. Note 273. The theological path thus opened by these strong men became the main path for science during ages, and it led the world ever further and further from any fruitful fact or useful method. Roger Bacon's investigations, already begun, were discredited. Worthless mixtures of scriptural legends with imperfectly authenticated physical facts took their place. Thus it was that for 1,200 years the minds in control of Europe regarded all real science as futile, and diverted the great current of earnest thought into theology. The next stage in this evolution was the development of an idea which acted with great force throughout the Middle Ages, the idea that science is dangerous. This belief was also of very ancient origin, from the time when the Egyptian magicians made their tremendous threat that unless their demands were granted they would reach out to the four corners of the earth, pull down the pillars of heaven, wreck the abodes of the gods above, and crush those of men below. Fear of these representatives of science is evident in the ancient world. But differences in the character of magic were recognized, some sorts being considered useful and some baleful. Of the former was magic used in curing diseases, in determining times auspicious for enterprises, and even in contributing to amusement. Of the latter was magic used to bring disease and death on men and animals, or tempests upon the growing crops. Hence gradually arose a general distinction between white magic, which dealt openly with the more beneficent means of nature, and black magic, which dealt secretly with occult, malignant powers. Down to the Christian era the fear of magic rarely led to any persecution very systematic or very cruel. While in Greece and Rome laws were at times enacted against magicians, they were only occasionally enforced with rigor, and finally, toward the end of the pagan empire, the feeling against them seemed dying out altogether. As to its more kindly phases, men like Marcus Aurelius and Julian did not hesitate to consult those who claimed to foretell the future. As to black magic, it seemed hardly worth while to enact severe laws when charms, amulets, and even gestures could thwart its worst machinations. Moreover, under the old empire a real science was coming in, and thought was progressing. Both the theory and practice of magic were more and more held up to ridicule. Even as early a writer as Ennius ridiculed the idea that magicians, who were generally poor and hungry themselves, could bestow wealth on others. Pliny, in his Natural Philosophy, showed at great length their absurdities and cheatery. Others followed in the same line of thought, and the whole theory, except among the very lowest classes, seemed dying out. But with the development of Christian theology came a change. The idea of the active interference of Satan in magic, which had come into the Hebrew mind with especial force from Persia during the captivity of Israel, had passed from the Hebrew Scriptures into Christianity, and had been made still stronger by various statements in the New Testament. Theologians laid stress especially upon the famous utterances of the psalmist that all the gods of the heathen are devils, and of St. Paul that The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils. And it was widely held that these devils were naturally indignant at their dethronement and anxious to wreak vengeance upon Christianity. Magicians were held to be active agents of these dethroned gods, and this persuasion was strengthened by sundry old practitioners in the art of magic, impostors who pretended to supernatural powers, and who made use of old rites and phrases inherited from paganism. Hence it was that as soon as Christianity came into power it more than renewed the old severities against the forbidden art, and one of the first acts of the Emperor Constantine after his conversion was to enact a most severe law against magic and magicians, under which the main offender might be burned alive. But here, too, it should be noted that a distinction between the two sorts of magic was recognized, for Constantine shortly afterward found it necessary to issue a proclamation stating that his intention was only to prohibit deadly and malignant magic, that he had no intention of prohibiting magic used to cure diseases and to protect the crops from hail and tempests. But as new emperors came to the throne, who had not in them that old leaven of paganism which to the last influenced Constantine, and as theology obtained a firmer hold, severity against magic increased. Toleration of it, even in its milder forms, was more and more denied. Black magic and white were classed together. This severity went on increasing and threatened the simplest efforts in physics and chemistry. Even the science of mathematics was looked upon with dread. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the older theology having arrived at the climax of its development in Europe, terror of magic and witchcraft took complete possession of the popular mind. In sculpture, painting, and literature it appeared in forms even more and more striking. The lives of saints were filled with it. The cathedral sculpture embodied it in every part. The storied windows made it all the more impressive. The missal painters wrought it not only into prayer books, but, despite the fact that hardly a trace of the belief appears in the Psalms, they illustrated it in the great illuminated psalters, from which the noblest part of the service was sung before the high altar. The service books showed every form of agonizing petition for delivery from this dire influence, and every form of exorcism for thwarting it. All the great theologians of the Church entered into this belief and aided to develop it. The fathers of the early Church were full and explicit, and the medieval doctors became more and more minute in describing the operations of the black art and in denouncing them. It was argued that, as the devil afflicted Job, so he and his minions continued to cause diseases; that, as Satan is the prince of the power of the air, he and his minions cause tempests; that the cases of Nebuchadnezzar and Lot's wife prove that sorcerers can transform human beings into animals or even lifeless matter; that as the devils of Gadara were cast into swine, all animals could be afflicted in the same manner; and that as Christ himself had been transported through the air by the power of Satan, so any human being might be thus transported to an exceeding high mountain. Thus the horror of magic and witchcraft increased on every hand, and in 1317 Pope John XII issued his bull Spontent Pariter, leveled at the alchemists, but really dealing a terrible blow at the beginnings of chemical science. That many alchemists were knavish is no doubt true, but no infallibility in separating the evil from the good was shown by the papacy in this matter. In this and in sundry other bulls and briefs we find Pope John, by virtue of his infallibility as the world's instructor in all that pertains to faith and morals, condemning real science and pseudo-science alike. In two of these documents, supposed to be inspired by wisdom from on high, he complains that both he and his flock are in danger of their lives by the arts of the sorcerers. He declares that such sorcerers can send devils into mirrors and finger rings, and kill men and women by a magic word; that they had tried to kill him by piercing a waxen image of him with needles in the name of the devil. He therefore called on all rulers, secular and ecclesiastical, to hunt down the miscreants who thus afflicted the faithful, and he especially increased the powers of inquisitors in various parts of Europe for this purpose. The impulse thus given to childish fear and hatred against the investigation of nature was felt for centuries. More and more chemistry came to be known as one of the seven devilish arts. Thus began a long series of demonstrations against magic from the center of Christendom. In 1437 and again in 1445, Pope Eugene IV issued bulls exhorting inquisitors to be more diligent in searching out and delivering over to punishment magicians and witches who produced bad weather, the result being that persecution received a fearful impulse. But the worst came 40 years later still, when in 1484 there came the yet more terrible bull of Pope Innocent VIII, known as Summis Desiderantes, which let inquisitors loose upon Germany, with Sprenger at their head, armed with the witch hammer, the fearful manual Malleus Maleficarum, to torture and destroy men and women by tens of thousands for sorcery and magic. Similar bulls were issued in 1504 by Julius II and in 1523 by Adrian VI. The system of repression thus begun lasted for hundreds of years. The Reformation did little to change it, and in Germany, where Catholics and Protestants vied with each other in proving their orthodoxy, it was at its worst. On German soil more than 100,000 victims are believed to have been sacrificed to it between the middle of the 15th and the middle of the 16th centuries. Thus it was that from St. Augustine to St. Thomas Aquinas, from Aquinas to Luther, and from Luther to Wesley, theologians of both branches of the Church, with hardly an exception, enforced the belief in magic and witchcraft, and, as far as they had power, carried out the injunction, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." How this was ended by the progress of scientific modes of thought I shall endeavor to show elsewhere. Here we are only concerned with the effect of this widespread terrorism on the germs and early growth of the physical sciences. Of course, the atmosphere created by this persecution of magicians was deadly to any open beginnings of experimental science. The conscience of the time, acting in obedience to the highest authorities of the Church, and, as was supposed, in defense of religion, now brought out a missile which it hurled against scientific investigators with deadly effect. The medieval battlefields of thought were strewn with various forms of it. This missile was the charge of unlawful compact with Satan, and it was most effective. We find it used against every great investigator of nature in those times and for ages after. The list of great men in those centuries charged with magic, as given by Node, is astounding. It includes every man of real mark, and in the midst of them stands one of the most thoughtful popes, Sylvester II. Gerbert, and the foremost of medieval thinkers on natural science, Albert the Great. It came to be the accepted idea that as soon as a man conceived a wish to study the works of God, his first step must be a league with the devil. It was entirely natural, then, that in 1163 Pope Alexander III, in connection with the Council of Tours, forbade the study of physics to all ecclesiastics, which, of course, in that age meant prohibition of all such scientific studies to the only persons likely to make them. What the Pope then expressly forbade was, in the words of the papal bull, "the study of physics or the laws of the world," and it was added that any person violating this rule "shall be avoided by all and excommunicated." Note 274. The first great thinker who, in spite of some stumbling into theologic pitfalls, persevered in a truly scientific path was Roger Bacon. His life and works seem until recently to have been generally misunderstood. He was formerly ranked as a superstitious alchemist who happened upon some inventions, but more recent investigation has shown him to be one of the great masters in the evolution of human thought. The advancement of sound historical judgment seems likely to bring the fame of the two who bear the name of Bacon nearly to equality. Bacon of the Chancellorship and of the Novum Organum may not wane, but Bacon of the prison cell and the Opus Majus steadily approaches him in brightness. More than 3 centuries before Francis Bacon advocated the experimental method, Roger Bacon practiced it, and the results, as now revealed, are wonderful. He wrought with power in many sciences, and his knowledge was sound and exact. By him, more than by any other man of the Middle Ages, was the world brought into the more fruitful paths of scientific thought, the paths which have led to the most precious inventions. Among these are clocks, lenses, and burning specula, which were given by him to the world, directly or indirectly. In his writings are found formulae for extracting phosphorus, manganese, and bismuth. It is even claimed, with much appearance of justice, that he investigated the power of steam, and he seems to have very nearly reached some of the principal doctrines of modern chemistry. But it should be borne in mind that his method of investigation was even greater than its results. In an age when theological subtilizing was alone thought to give the title of scholar, he insisted on real reasoning and the aid of natural science by mathematics. In an age when experimenting was sure to cost a man his reputation and was likely to cost him his life, he insisted on experimenting, and braved all its risks. Few greater men have lived. As we follow Bacon's process of reasoning regarding the refraction of light, we see that he was divinely inspired. On this man came the brunt of the battle. The most conscientious men of his time thought it their duty to fight him, and they fought him steadily and bitterly. His sin was not disbelief in Christianity, not want of fidelity to the Church, not even dissent from the main lines of orthodoxy. On the contrary, he showed in all his writings a desire to strengthen Christianity, to build up the Church, and to develop orthodoxy. He was attacked and condemned mainly because he did not believe that philosophy had become complete and that nothing more was to be learned. He was condemned, as his opponents expressly declared, on account of certain suspicious novelties, propter quasdam novitates suspectas. Upon his return to Oxford about 1250, the forces of unreason beset him on all sides. Greatest of all his enemies was Bonaventura. This enemy was the theologic idol of the period. The learned world knew him as the seraphic doctor. Dante gave him an honored place in the great poem of the Middle Ages. The Church finally enrolled him among the saints. By force of great ability in theology he had become, in the middle of the 13th century, general of the Franciscan order. Thus, as Bacon's master, his hands were laid heavily on the new teaching, so that in 1257 the troublesome monk was forbidden to lecture. All men were solemnly warned not to listen to his teaching, and he was ordered to Paris, to be kept under surveillance by the monastic authorities. Herein was exhibited another of the myriad examples showing the care exercised over scientific teaching by the Church. The reasons for thus dealing with Bacon were evident. First, he had dared attempt scientific explanations of natural phenomena, which under the mystic theology of the Middle Ages had been referred simply to supernatural causes. Typical was his explanation of the causes and character of the rainbow. It was clear, cogent, a great step in the right direction as regards physical science. But there, in the book of Genesis, stood the legend regarding the origin of the rainbow, supposed to have been dictated immediately by the Holy Spirit, and according to that, the bow in the cloud was not the result of natural laws, but a sign arbitrarily placed in the heavens for the simple purpose of assuring mankind that there was not to be another universal deluge. But this was not the worst. Another theological idea was arrayed against him, the idea of satanic intervention in science. Hence he was attacked with the goodly missile with which the epithets infidel and atheist has been decided the fate of so many battles, the charge of magic and compact with Satan. He defended himself with a most unfortunate weapon, a weapon which exploded in his hands and injured him more than the enemy, for he argued against the idea of compacts with Satan, and showed that much which is ascribed to demons results from natural means. This added fuel to the flame. To limit the power of Satan was deemed hardly less impious than to limit the power of God. The most powerful protectors availed him little. His friend Guy of Foulques, having in 1265 been made pope under the name of Clement IV, shielded him for a time, but the fury of the enemy was too strong, and when he made ready to perform a few experiments before a small audience, we are told that all Oxford was in an uproar. It was believed that Satan was about to be let loose. Everywhere priests, monks, fellows, and students rushed about, their garments streaming in the wind, and everywhere rose the cry, "Down with the magician!" And this cry, "Down with the magician!" resounded from cell to cell and from hall to hall. Another weapon was also used upon the battlefields of science in that time, with much effect. The Arabs had made many noble discoveries in science, and Averroes had, in the opinion of many, divided the honors with St. Thomas Aquinas. These facts gave the new missile. It was the epithet Mohammedan. This, too, was flung with effect at Bacon. The attack now began to take its final shape. The two great religious orders, Franciscan and Dominican, then in all the vigor of their youth, vied with each other in fighting the new thought in chemistry and physics. St. Dominic solemnly condemned research by experiment and observation. The general of the Franciscan order took similar ground. In 1243 the Dominicans interdicted every member of their order from the study of medicine and natural philosophy, and in 1287 this interdiction was extended to the study of chemistry. In 1278 the authorities of the Franciscan order, assembled at Paris, solemnly condemned Bacon's teaching, and the general of the Franciscans, Jerome of Ascoli, afterward pope, threw him into prison, where he remained for 14 years. Though Pope Clement IV had protected him, Popes Nicholas III and IV, by virtue of their infallibility, decided that he was too dangerous to be at large, and he was only released at the age of 80, but a year or two before death placed him beyond the reach of his enemies. How deeply the struggle had racked his mind may be gathered from that last affecting declaration of his, "Would that I had not given myself so much trouble for the love of science." The attempt has been made by sundry champions of the Church to show that some of Bacon's utterances against ecclesiastical and other corruptions in his time were the main cause of the severity which the Church authorities exercised against him. This helps the Church but little, even if it be well based, but it is not well based. That some of his utterances of this sort made him enemies is doubtless true, but the charges on which St. Bonaventura silenced him, and Jerome of Ascoli imprisoned him, and successive popes kept him in prison for 14 years, were dangerous novelties and suspected sorcery. Sad is it to think of what this great man might have given to the world had ecclesiasticism allowed the gift. He held the key of treasures which would have freed mankind from ages of error and misery. With his discoveries as a basis, with his method as a guide, what might not the world have gained? Nor was the wrong done to that age alone. It was done to this age also. The 19th century was robbed at the same time with the 13th. But for that interference with science, the 19th century would be enjoying discoveries which will not be reached before the 20th century, and even later. Thousands of precious lives shall be lost. Tens of thousands shall suffer discomfort, privation, sickness, poverty, ignorance, for lack of discoveries and methods which, but for this mistaken dealing with Roger Bacon and his compeers, would now be blessing the earth. In 2 recent years 60,000 children died in England and in Wales of scarlet fever. Probably quite as many died in the United States. Had not Bacon been hindered, we should have had in our hands by this time the means to save 2/3 of these victims, and the same is true of typhoid, typhus, cholera, and that great class of diseases of whose physical causes science is just beginning to get an inkling. Put together all the efforts of all the atheists who have ever lived, and they have not done so much harm to Christianity and the world as has been done by the narrow-minded, conscientious men who persecuted Roger Bacon and closed the path which he gave his life to open. But despite the persecution of Bacon and the defection of those who ought to have followed him, champions of the experimental method rose from time to time during the succeeding centuries. We know little of them personally. Our main knowledge of their efforts is derived from the endeavors of their persecutors. Under such guidance the secular rulers were naturally vigorous. In France, Charles V forbade, in 1380, the possession of furnaces and apparatus necessary for chemical processes. Under this law the chemist John Barillon was thrown into prison, and it was only by the greatest effort that his life was saved. In England, Henry IV, in 1404, issued a similar decree. In Italy, the Republic of Venice, in 1418, followed these examples. The judicial torture and murder of Antonio de Dominis were not simply for heresy. His investigations in the phenomena of light were an additional crime. In Spain everything like scientific research was crushed out among Christians. Some earnest efforts were afterward made by Jews and Moors, but these were finally ended by persecution. And to this hour the Spanish race, in some respects the most gifted in Europe, which began its career with everything in its favor and with every form of noble achievement, remains in intellectual development behind every other in Christendom. To question the theological view of physical science was, even long after the close of the Middle Ages, exceedingly perilous. We have seen how one of Roger Bacon's unpardonable offenses was his argument against the efficacy of magic, and how, centuries afterward, Cornelius Agrippa, Weyr, Flade, Luce, Becker, and a multitude of other investigators and thinkers suffered confiscation of property, loss of position, and even torture and death for similar views. Note 275. The theological atmosphere which in consequence settled down about the greatest universities and colleges seemed likely to stifle all scientific effort in every part of Europe, and it is one of the great wonders in human history that in spite of this deadly atmosphere a considerable body of thinking men, under such protection as they could secure, still persisted in devoting themselves to the physical sciences. In Italy, in the latter half of the 16th century, came a striking example of the difficulties which science still encountered even after the Renaissance had undermined the old beliefs. At that time John Baptist Porta was conducting his investigations, and despite a considerable mixture of pseudo-science they were fruitful. His was not black magic, claiming the aid of Satan, but white magic, bringing into service the laws of nature, the precursor of applied science. His book on meteorology was the first in which sound ideas were broached on this subject. His researches in optics gave the world the camera obscura, and possibly the telescope. In chemistry he seems to have been the first to show how to reduce the metallic oxides, and thus to have laid the foundation of several important industries. He did much to change natural philosophy from a black art to a vigorous open science. He encountered the old ecclesiastical policy. The society founded by him for physical research, I Secreti, was broken up, and he was summoned to Rome by Pope Paul III and forbidden to continue his investigations. So, too, in France. In 1624 some young chemists at Paris, having taught the experimental method and cut loose from Aristotle, the faculty of theology beset the Parliament of Paris, and the Parliament prohibited these new chemical researches under the severest penalties. The same war continued in Italy. Even after the belief in magic had been seriously weakened, the old theological fear and dislike of physical science continued. In 1657 occurred the first sitting of the Accademia del Cimento at Florence, under the presidency of Prince Leopold de' Medici. This academy promised great things for science. It was open to all talent. Its only fundamental law was the repudiation of any favorite system or sect of philosophy, and the obligation to investigate nature by the pure light of experiment. It entered into scientific investigations with energy. Borelli in mathematics, Redi in natural history, and many others enlarged the boundaries of knowledge. Heat, light, magnetism, electricity, projectiles, digestion, and the incompressibility of water were studied by the right method and with results that enriched the world. The Academy was a fortress of science, and siege was soon laid to it. The votaries of scholastic learning denounced it as irreligious. Quarrels were fomented. Leopold was bribed with a cardinal's hat and drawn away to Rome, and after 10 years of beleaguering the fortress fell. Borelli was left a beggar. Oliva killed himself in despair. So, too, the noted Academy of Lincei at times incurred the ill will of the papacy by the very fact that it included thoughtful investigators. It was patronized by Pope Urban VIII in such a manner as to paralyze it, and it was afterward vexed by Pope Gregory XVI. Even in our own time sessions of scientific associations were discouraged and thwarted by as kindly a pontiff as Pius IX. Note 276. A hostility similar in kind, though less in degree, was shown in Protestant countries. Even after Thomasius in Germany and Voltaire in France and Beccaria in Italy had given final blows to the belief in magic and witchcraft throughout Christendom, the traditional orthodox distrust of the physical sciences continued for a long time. In England a marked dislike was shown among various leading ecclesiastics and theologians toward the Royal Society, and later toward the Association for the Advancement of Science, and this dislike, as will hereafter be seen, sometimes took shape in serious opposition. As a rule, both in Protestant and Catholic countries, instruction in chemistry and physics was for a long time discouraged by church authorities, and when its suppression was no longer possible, great pains were taken to subordinate it to instruction supposed to be more fully in accordance with the older methods of theological reasoning. I have now presented in outline the more direct and open struggle of the physical sciences with theology, mainly as an exterior foe. We will next consider their warfare with the same foe in its more subtle form, mainly as a vitiating and sterilizing principle in science itself. We have seen thus far first how such men as Eusebius, Lactantius, and their compeers opposed scientific investigation as futile. Next, how such men as Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, and the multitude who followed them turned the main current of medieval thought from science to theology, and finally how a long line of church authorities from Popes John XXII and Innocent VIII, and the heads of great religious orders, down to various theologians and ecclesiastics, Catholic and Protestant, of a very recent period, endeavored first to crush and afterward to discourage scientific research as dangerous. Yet, injurious as all this was to the evolution of science, there was developed something in many respects more destructive, and this was the influence of mystic theology, penetrating, permeating, vitiating, sterilizing nearly every branch of science for hundreds of years. Among the forms taken by this development in the earlier Middle Ages We find a mixture of physical science with a pseudoscience obtained from texts of Scripture. In compounding this mixture, Jews and Christians vied with each other. In this process the sacred books were used as a fetish, every word, every letter being considered to have a divine and hidden meaning. By combining various scriptural letters in various abstruse ways, new words of prodigious significance in magic were obtained, and among them the great word embracing the 72 mystical names of God, the mighty word Schemenphoros. Why should men seek knowledge by observation and experiment in the book of nature, when the book of Revelation, interpreted by the Kabbalah, opens such treasures to the ingenious believer? So, too, we have ancient mystical theories of number which the theological spirit had made Christian, usurping an enormous place in medieval science. The sacred power of the number 3 was seen in the Trinity, in the three main divisions of the universe, the empyrean, the heavens, and the earth, in the three angelic hierarchies, in the three choirs of seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, in the three of dominions, virtues, and powers, in the three of principalities, archangels, and angels, in the three orders in the church, bishops, priests, and deacons, in the three classes, the baptized, the communicants, and the monks, in the three degrees of attainment, light, purity, and knowledge, in the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, and in much else. All this was brought into theologico-scientific relation, then and afterward, with the three dimensions of space, with the three divisions of time, past, present, and future, with the three realms of the physical world, sky, earth, and sea, with the three constituents of man, body, soul, and spirit, with the threefold enemies of man, the world, the flesh, and the devil, with the three kingdoms in nature, mineral, vegetable, and animal, with the three colors, red, yellow, and blue, with the three eyes of the honey bee, and with a multitude of other analogues equally precious. The sacred power of the number 7 was seen in the 7 golden candlesticks and the 7 churches in the Apocalypse, in the 7 cardinal virtues and the 7 deadly sins, in the 7 liberal arts and the 7 devilish arts, and above all in the 7 sacraments. And as this proved in astrology that there could be only 7 planets, so it proved in alchemy that there must be exactly 7 metals. The 12 apostles were connected with the 12 signs in the zodiac, and with much in physical science. The 72 disciples, the 72 interpreters of the Old Testament, the 72 mystical names of God, were connected with the alleged fact in anatomy that there were 72 joints in the human frame. Then also there were revived such theologic and metaphysical substitutes for scientific thought as the declaration that the perfect line is a circle, and hence that the planets must move in absolute circles, a statement which led astronomy astray even when the great truths of the Copernican theory were well in sight. Also the declaration that nature abhors a vacuum, a statement which led physics astray until Torricelli made his experiments. Also the declaration that we see the lightning before we hear the thunder, because sight is nobler than hearing. In chemistry we have the same theologic tendency to magic, and as a result a muddle of science and theology, which from one point of view seems blasphemous and from another idiotic, but which none the less sterilized physical investigation for ages. That debased Platonism, which had been such an important factor in the evolution of Christian theology from the earliest days of the Church, continued its work. As everything in inorganic nature was supposed to have spiritual significance, the doctrines of the Trinity and Incarnation were turned into an argument in behalf of the philosopher's stone. Arguments for the scheme of redemption and for transubstantiation suggested others of similar construction to prove the transmutation of metals. The doctrine of the resurrection of the human body was by similar mystic jugglery connected with the processes of distillation and sublimation. Even after the Middle Ages were past, strong men seemed unable to break away from such reasoning as this, among them such leaders as Basil Valentine in the 15th century, Agricola in the 16th, and Van Helmont in the 17th. The greatest theologians contributed to the welter of unreason from which this pseudo-science was developed. One question largely discussed was whether at the redemption it was necessary for God to take the human form. Thomas Aquinas answered that it was necessary, but William Ockham and Duns Scotus answered that it was not, that God might have taken the form of a stone, or of a log, or of a beast. The possibilities open to wild substitutes for science by this sort of reasoning were infinite. Men have often asked how it was that the Arabians accomplished so much in scientific discovery as compared with Christian investigators. But the answer is easy. The Arabians were comparatively free from these theologic allurements which in Christian Europe flickered in the air on all sides, luring men into paths which led nowhither. Strong investigators like Arnold of Villanova, Raymond Lully, Basil Valentine, Paracelsus, and their compeers were thus drawn far out of the only paths which led to fruitful truths. In a work generally ascribed to the first of these, the student is told that in mixing his chemicals he must repeat the psalm Exurge Domine, and that on certain chemical vessels must be placed the last words of Jesus on the cross. Vincent of Beauvais insisted that, as the Bible declares that Noah, when 500 years old, had children born to him, he must have possessed alchemical means of preserving life; and much later Dickson insisted that the patriarchs generally must have owed their long lives to such means. It was loudly declared that the reality of the philosopher's stone was proved by the words of St. John in the Revelation, "To him that overcometh I will give a white stone." The reasonableness of seeking to develop gold out of the baser metals was, for many generations, based upon the doctrine of the resurrection of the physical body, which, though explicitly denied by St. Paul, had become a part of the creed of the Church. Martin Luther was especially drawn to believe in the alchemistic doctrine of transmutation by this analogy. The Bible was everywhere used, both among Protestants and Catholics, in support of these mystic adulterations of science, and one writer, as late as 1751, based his alchemistic arguments on more than 100 passages of Scripture. As an example of this sort of reasoning, we have a proof that the elect will preserve the philosopher's stone until the last judgment, drawn from a passage in St. Paul's epistle to the Corinthians, "We have this treasure in earthen vessels." The greatest thinkers devoted themselves to adding new ingredients to this strange mixture of scientific and theologic thought. The Catholic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, the Protestant mysticism of Jacob Boehme, and the alchemistic reveries of Basil Valentine were all cast into this seething mass; and when alchemy in its old form had been discredited, we find scriptural arguments no less perverse, and even comical, used on the other side. As an example of this, just before the greatest discoveries by Stahl, we find the valuable scientific efforts of Becher opposed with the following syllogism: "King Solomon, according to the Scriptures, possessed the united wisdom of heaven and earth; but King Solomon knew nothing about alchemy," or chemistry in the form it then took, "and sent his vessels to Ophir to seek gold, and levied taxes upon his subjects; ergo alchemy (or chemistry) has no reality or truth." And we find that Becher is absolutely turned away from his labors, and obliged to devote himself to proving that Solomon used more money than he possibly could have obtained from Ophir or his subjects, and therefore that he must have possessed a knowledge of chemical methods and philosopher's stone as a result of them. Note 277. Of the general reasoning enforced by theology regarding physical science, every age has shown examples. Yet out of them all I will select but two, and these are given because they show how this mixture of theological and scientific ideas took hold upon the stronger supporters of better reasoning even after the power of medieval theology seemed broken. The first of these examples is Melanchthon. He was the scholar of the Reformation, and justly won the title Preceptor of Germany. His mind was singularly open, his sympathies broad, and his usual freedom from bigotry drew down upon him that wrath of Protestant heresy hunters which embittered the last years of his life and tortured him upon his deathbed. During his career at the University of Wittenberg he gave a course of lectures on physics, and in these he dwelt upon scriptural texts as affording scientific proofs, accepted the interference of the devil in physical phenomena as in other things, and applied the medieval method throughout his whole work. Note 278. Yet far more remarkable was the example, a century later, of the man who more than any other led the world out of the path opened by Aquinas and into that through which modern thought has advanced to its greatest conquests. Strange as it may at first seem, Francis Bacon, whose keenness of sight revealed the delusions of the old path and the promises of the new, and whose boldness did so much to turn the world from the old path into the new, presents in his own writings one of the most striking examples of the evil he did so much to destroy. The Novum Organon, considering the time when it came from his pen, is doubtless one of the greatest exhibitions of genius in the history of human thought. It showed the modern world the way out of the scholastic method and reverence for dogma into the experimental method and reverence for fact. In it occur many passages which show that the great philosopher was fully alive to the danger both to religion and to science arising from their mixture. He declares that the corruption of philosophy from superstition and theology introduced the greatest amount of evil both into whole systems of philosophy and into their parts. He denounces those who have endeavored to found a natural philosophy on the books of Genesis and Job and other sacred scriptures, so seeking the dead among the living. He speaks of the result as an unwholesome mixture of things human and divine, not merely fantastic philosophy, but heretical religion. He refers to the opposition of the Fathers to the doctrine of rotundity of the earth, and says that, thanks to some of them, you may find the approach to any kind of philosophy, however improved, entirely closed up. He charges that some of these divines are afraid lest perhaps a deeper inquiry into nature should penetrate beyond the allowed limits of sobriety, and finally speaks of theologians as sometimes craftily conjecturing that, if science be little understood, each single thing can be referred more easily to the hand and rod of God, and says, "This is nothing more or less than wishing to please God by a lie." No man who has reflected upon the annals of his race can, without a feeling of awe, come into the presence of such clearness of insight and boldness of utterance, and the first thought of the reader is that, of all men, Francis Bacon is the most free from the unfortunate bias he condemns, that he certainly cannot be deluded into the old path. But as we go on through his main work we are surprised to find that the strong arm of Aquinas has been stretched over the intervening ages, and has laid hold upon this master thinker of the 17th century. For only a few chapters beyond those containing the citations already made, we find Bacon alluding to the recent voyage of Columbus, and speaking of the prophecy of Daniel regarding the latter days, that many shall run to and fro, and knowledge be increased, as clearly signifying that the circumnavigation of the world and the increase of science should happen in the same age. Note 279. In his great work on the advancement of learning, the firm grasp which the methods he condemned held upon him is shown yet more clearly. In the first book of it he asserts that "that excellent book of Job, if it be revolved with diligence, will be found pregnant and swelling with natural philosophy," and he endeavors to show that in it the "roundness of the earth, the fixing of the stars ever standing at equal distances, the depression of the southern pole, the matter of generation, and matter of minerals are with great elegancy noted." But curiously enough he uses to support some of these truths the very texts which the fathers of the Church used to destroy them, and those for which he finds Scripture warrant most clearly are such as science has since disproved. So, too, he says that Solomon was enabled in his Proverbs "by donation of God to compile a natural history of all verdure." Note 280. Such was the struggle of the physical sciences in general. Let us now look briefly at one special example out of many, which reveals, as well as any, one of the main theories which prompted theological interference with them. It will doubtless seem amazing to many that for ages the weight of theological thought in Christendom was thrown against the idea of the suffocating properties of certain gases, and especially of carbonic acid. Although in antiquity we see men forming a right theory of gases in mines, we find that early in the history of the Church St. Clement of Alexandria put forth the theory that these gases are manifestations of diabolical action, and that throughout Christendom suffocation in caverns, wells, and cellars was attributed to the direct action of evil spirits. Evidences of this view abound through the medieval period, and during the Reformation period a great authority, Agricola, one of the most earnest and truthful of investigators, still adhered to the belief that these gases in mines were manifestations of devils, and he specified two classes, one of malignant imps who blow out the miners' lamps, and the other of friendly imps who simply tease the workmen in various ways. He went so far as to say that one of these spirits in the Saxon mine of Annaberg destroyed 12 workmen at once by the power of his breath. At the end of the 16th century we find a writer on mineralogy complaining that the mines in France and Germany had been in large part abandoned on account of the evil spirits of metals which had taken possession of them. Even as late as the 17th century Van Helmont, after he had broken away from alchemy and opened one of the great paths to chemistry, even after he had announced to the world the existence of various gases and the mode of their generation, was not strong enough to free himself from theologic bias. He still inclined to believe that the gases he had discovered were in some sense living spirits, beneficent or diabolical. But at various periods glimpses of the truth had been gained. The ancient view had not been entirely forgotten, and as far back as the first part of the 13th century Albert the Great suggested a natural cause in the possibility of exhalations from minerals causing a corruption of the air, but he, as we have seen, was driven or dragged off into theological studies, and the world relapsed into the theological view. Toward the end of the 15th century there had come a great genius laden with important truths in chemistry, but for whom the world was not ready, Basil Valentine. His discoveries anticipated much that has brought fame and fortune to chemists since, yet so fearful of danger was he that his work was carefully concealed. Not until after his death was his treatise on alchemy found, and even then it was for a long time not known where and when he lived. The papal bull Spondet Pariter, and the various prohibitions it bred, forcing other alchemists to conceal their laboratories, led him to let himself be known during his life at Erfurt simply as an apothecary, and to wait until after his death to make a revelation of truth which during his lifetime might have cost him dear. Among the legacies of this greatest of the alchemists was the doctrine that the air which asphyxiates workers in mines is similar to that which is produced by fermentation of malt, and a recommendation that, in order to drive away the evil and to prevent serious accidents, fires must be lighted and jets of steam used to ventilate the mines, stress being especially laid upon the idea that the danger in the mines is produced by exhalations of metals. Thanks to men like Valentine, this idea of the interference of Satan and his minions with the mining industry was gradually weakened, and the working of the deserted mines was resumed, yet even at a comparatively recent period we find it still lingering, and among leading divines in the very heart of Protestant Germany. In 1715 a cellar digger having been stifled at Jena, the medical faculty of the university decided that the cause was not the direct action of the devil, but a deadly gas. Thereupon Professor Laker, of the University of Wittenberg, entered a solemn protest, declaring that the decision of the medical faculty was "only a proof of the lamentable license which has so taken possession of us, and which, if we are not earnestly on our guard, will finally turn away from us the blessing of God." Note 281. But denunciations of this kind could not hold back the little army of science. In spite of adverse influences the evolution of physics and chemistry went on. More and more there rose men bold enough to break away from theological methods, and strong enough to resist ecclesiastical bribes and threats. As alchemy in its first form, seeking for the philosopher's stone and the transmutation of metals, had given way to alchemy in its second form, seeking for the elixir of life and remedies more or less magical for disease, so now the latter yielded to the search for truth as truth. More and more the solemnly constituted impostors were resisted in every field. A great line of physicists and chemists began to appear. Note 282. End of Chapter 12, Section 1. Section 36 of A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 12, From Magic to Chemistry and Physics, Section 2. Just at the middle of the 17th century, and at the very center of opposition to physical science, Robert Boyle began the new epoch in chemistry. Strongly influenced by the writings of Bacon and the discoveries of Galileo, he devoted himself to scientific research, establishing at Oxford a laboratory, and putting into it a chemist from Strasbourg. For this he was at once bitterly attacked. In spite of his high position, his blameless life, his liberal gifts to charity and learning, the Oxford pulpit was especially severe against him, declaring that his researches were destroying religion and his experiments undermining the university. Public orators denounced him, the wits ridiculed him, and his associates in the peerage were indignant that he should condescend to pursuits so unworthy. But Boyle pressed on. His discoveries opened new paths in various directions, and gave an impulse to a succession of vigorous investigators. Thus began the long series of discoveries culminating those of Black, Bergman, Cavendish, Priestley, and Lavoisier, who ushered in the chemical science of the 19th century. Yet not even then without a sore struggle against unreason. And it must here be noticed that this unreason was not all theological. The unreasoning heterodox, when entrusted with irresponsible power, can be as short-sighted and cruel as the unreasoning orthodox. Lavoisier, one of the best of our race, not only a great chemist but a true man, was sent to the scaffold by the Parisian mob, led by bigoted liberals and atheists, with the sneer that the Republic had no need of savants. As to Priestley, who had devoted his life to science and to every good work among his fellow men, the Birmingham mob, favored by the Anglican clergymen who harangued them as fellow churchmen, wrecked his house, destroyed his library, philosophical instruments, and papers containing the results of long years of scientific research, drove him into exile, and would have murdered him if they could have laid their hands upon him. Nor was it entirely his devotion to rational liberty, nor even his disbelief in the doctrine of the Trinity, which brought on this catastrophe. That there was a deep distrust of his scientific pursuits was evident when the leaders of the mob took pains to use his electrical apparatus to set fire to his papers. Still, though theological modes of thought continued to sterilize much effort in chemistry, the old influence was more and more thrown off, and truth sought more and more for truth's sake. Black magic with its satanic machinery vanished, only reappearing occasionally among marvel-mongers and belated theologians. White magic became legerdemain. In the early years of the 19th century, physical research, though it went on with ever-increasing vigor, felt in various ways the reaction which followed the French Revolution. It was not merely under the Bourbons and Habsburgs that resistance was offered. Even in England the old spirit lingered long. As late as 1832, when the British Association for the Advancement of Science first visited Oxford, no less amiable a man than John Keble, at that time a power in the university, condemned indignantly the conferring of honorary degrees upon the leading men thus brought together. In a letter of that date to Dr. Pusey, he complained bitterly, to use his own words, that "the Oxford doctors have truckled sadly to the spirit of the times in receiving the hodge-podge of philosophers as they did." It is interesting to know that among the men thus contemptuously characterized were Brewster, Faraday, and Dalton. Nor was this a mere isolated exhibition of feeling. It lasted many years, and was especially known on both sides of the Atlantic in all higher institutions of learning where theology was dominant. Down to a period within the memory of men still in active life, students in the sciences, not only at Oxford and Cambridge, but at Harvard and Yale, were considered a doubtful, if not a distinctly inferior class, intellectually and socially, to be relegated to different instructors and buildings, and to receive their degrees on a different occasion and with different ceremonies from those appointed for students in literature. To the State University of Michigan, among the greater American institutions of learning which have never possessed or been possessed by a theological seminary, belongs the honor of first breaking down this wall of separation. But from the middle years of the century, chemical science progressed with ever accelerating force, and the work of Bunsen, Kirchhoff, Dalton, and Faraday has, in the last years of the century, led up to the establishment of Mendeleeff's law, by which chemistry has become predictive, as astronomy had become predictive by the calculations of Newton, and biology by the discoveries of Darwin. While one succession of strong men were thus developing chemistry out of one form of magic, another succession were developing physics out of another form. First in this latter succession may be mentioned that line of thinkers who divined and reasoned out great physical laws, a line extending from Galileo and Kepler and Newton to Ohm and Faraday and Joule and Helmholtz. These, by revealing more and more clearly the reign of law, steadily undermined the older theological view of arbitrary influence in nature. Next should be mentioned the line of profound observers, from Galileo and Torricelli to Kelvin. These have as thoroughly undermined the old theologic substitution of phrases for facts. When Galileo dropped the differing weights from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, he began the end of Aristotelian authority in physics. When Torricelli balanced a column of mercury against a column of water, and each of these against a column of air, he ended the theologic phrase that "nature abhors a vacuum." When Newton approximately determined the velocity of sound, he ended the theologic argument that we see the flash before we hear the roar, because sight is nobler than hearing. When Franklin showed that lightning is caused by electricity, and Ohm and Faraday proved that electricity obeys ascertained laws, they ended the theological idea of a divinity seated above the clouds and casting thunderbolts. Resulting from the labor of both these branches of physical science, we have the establishment of the great laws of the indestructibility of matter, the correlation of forces, and chemical affinity. Thereby is ended, with various other sacred traditions, the theological theory of a visible universe created out of nothing, so firmly embedded in the theological thought of the Middle Ages and in the Westminster Catechism. Note 283. In our own time some attempt has been made to renew this war against the physical sciences. Joseph de Maistre, uttering his hatred of them, declaring that mankind has paid too dearly for them, asserting that they must be subjected to theology, likening them to fire, good men when confined and dangerous when scattered about, has been one of the main leaders among those who can not relinquish the idea that our body of sacred literature should be kept a controlling textbook of science. The only effect of such teachings has been to weaken the legitimate hold of religion upon men. In Catholic countries, exertion has of late years been mainly confined to excluding science or diluting it in university teachings. Early in the present century a great effort was made by Ferdinand VII of Spain. He simply dismissed the scientific professors from the University of Salamanca, and until a recent period there has been general exclusion from Spanish universities of professors holding to the Newtonian physics. So, too, the contemporary Emperor of Austria attempted indirectly something of the same sort, and at a still later period Popes Gregory XVI and Pius IX discouraged, if they did not forbid, the meetings of scientific associations in Italy. In France, war between theology and science, which had long been smoldering, came in the years 1867 and 1868 to an outbreak. Toward the end of the last century, after the Church had held possession of advanced instruction for more than 1,000 years, and had, so far as it was able, kept experimental science in servitude, after it had humiliated Buffon in natural science, thrown its weight against Newton in the physical sciences, and wrecked Turgot's noble plans for a system of public instruction, the French nation decreed the establishment of the most thorough and complete system of higher instruction in science ever known. It was kept under lay control and became one of the glories of France, but emboldened by the restoration of the Bourbons in 1815, the Church began to undermine this hated system, and in 1868 had made such progress that all was ready for the final assault. Foremost among the leaders of the besieging party was the Bishop of Orleans, Dupanloup, a man of many winning characteristics and of great oratorical power. In various ways, and especially in an open letter, he had fought the materialism of science at Paris, and especially were his attacks leveled at Professors Vulpian and C and the Minister of Public Instruction, Duruy, a man of great merit, whose only crime was devotion to the improvement of education and to the promotion of the highest research in science. Note 284. The main attack was made rather upon biological science than upon physics and chemistry, yet it was clear that all were involved together. The first onslaught was made in the French Senate, and the storming party in that body was led by a venerable and conscientious prelate, Cardinal de Bonchaux, Archbishop of Rouen. It was charged by him and his party that the tendencies of the higher scientific teaching at Paris were fatal to religion and morality. Heavy missiles were hurled, such phrases as sapping the foundations, breaking down the bulwarks, and the like, and withal a new missile was used with much effect, the epithet materialist. The results can be easily guessed. Crowds came to the lecture rooms of the attacked professors, and the lecture room of Professor C, the chief offender, was crowded to suffocation. A siege was begun in due form. A young physician was sent by the Cardinal's party into the heterodox camp as a spy. Having heard one lecture of Professor C., he returned with information that seemed to promise easy victory to the besieging party. He brought a terrible statement, one that seemed enough to overwhelm C., Vulpian, de Rue, and the whole hated system of public instruction in France, the statement that C. had denied the existence of the human soul. Cardinal Bonchose seized the tremendous weapon at once. Rising in his place in the Senate, he launched a most eloquent invective against the minister of state who could protect such a fortress of impiety as the College of Medicine, and as a climax he asserted, on the evidence of his spy, fresh from Professor C.'s lecture room, that the professor had declared, in his lecture of the day before, that so long as he had the honor to hold his professorship he would combat the false idea of the existence of the soul. The weapon seemed resistless, and the wound fatal, but M. Duruy rose and asked to be heard. His statement was simply that he held in his hand documentary proofs that Professor C. never made such a declaration. He held the notes used by Professor C. in his lecture. Professor C., it appeared, belonged to a school in medical science which combated certain ideas regarding medicine as an art. The inflamed imagination of the Cardinal's heresy-hunting emissary had, as the lecture notes proved, led him to mistake the word art for âme, and to exhibit Professor C. as treating a theological when he was discussing a purely scientific question. Of the existence of the soul the professor had said nothing. The forces of the enemy were immediately turned. They retreated in confusion, amid the laughter of all France, and a quiet, dignified statement as to the rights of scientific instructors by Wurtz, dean of the faculty, completed their discomfiture. Thus a well-meant attempt to check science simply ended in bringing ridicule on religion, and in thrusting still deeper into the minds of thousands of men that most mistaken of all mistaken ideas, the conviction that religion and science are enemies. Note 285. But justice forbids raising an outcry against Roman Catholicism for this. In 1864 a number of excellent men in England drew up a declaration to be signed by students in the natural sciences, expressing "sincere regret that researches into scientific truth are perverted by some in our time into occasion for casting doubt upon the truth and authenticity of the Holy Scriptures." 9/10 of the leading scientific men of England refused to sign it. Nor was this all. Sir John Herschel, Sir John Bowring, and Sir W. R. Hamilton administered, through the press, castigations which roused general indignation against the proposers of the circular, and Professor De Morgan, by a parody, covered memorial and memorialists with ridicule. It was the old mistake, and the old result followed in the minds of multitudes of thoughtful young men. Note 286. And in yet another Protestant country this same mistake was made. In 1868 several excellent churchmen in Prussia thought it their duty to meet for the denunciation of "science falsely so called." Two results followed. Upon the great majority of these really self-sacrificing men, whose first utterances showed complete ignorance of the theories they attacked, there came quiet and widespread contempt. Upon Pastor Knapp, who stood forth and proclaimed views of the universe which he thought scriptural, but which most schoolboys knew to be childish, came a burst of good-natured derision from every quarter of the German nation. Note 287. But in all the greater modern nations warfare of this kind after the first quarter of the 19th century became more and more futile. While conscientious Roman bishops and no less conscientious Protestant clergymen in Europe and America continued to insist that advanced education, not only in literature but in science, should be kept under careful control in their own sectarian universities and colleges, wretchedly one-sided in organization and inadequate in equipment; while Catholic clerical authorities in Spain were rejecting all professors holding the Newtonian theory, and in Austria and Italy all holding unsafe views regarding the Immaculate Conception, and while Protestant clerical authorities in Great Britain and America were keeping out of professorships men holding unsatisfactory views regarding the Incarnation, or infant baptism, or the apostolic succession, or ordination by elders, or the perseverance of the saints, and while both Catholic and Protestant ecclesiastics were openly or secretly weeding out of university faculties all who showed willingness to consider fairly the ideas of Darwin, a movement was quietly in progress destined to take instruction, and especially instruction in the physical and natural sciences, out of its old subordination to theology and ecclesiasticism. Note 288. The most striking beginnings of this movement had been seen when, in the darkest period of the French Revolution, there was founded at Paris the great Conservatory of Arts and Trades, and when in the early years of the 19th century scientific and technical education spread quietly upon the continent. By the middle of the century France and Germany were dotted with well equipped technical and scientific schools, each having chemical and physical laboratories. The English-speaking lands lagged behind. In England, Oxford and Cambridge showed few, if any, signs of this movement, and in the United States, down to 1850, evidences of it were few and feeble. Very significant is it that at that period, while Yale College had in its faculty Silliman and Olmsted, the professor of chemistry and the professor of physics most widely known in the United States, it had no physical or chemical laboratory in the modern sense, and confined its instruction in these subjects to examinations upon a textbook and the presentation of a few lectures. At the State University of Michigan, which had even then taken a foremost place in the higher education west of the Great Lakes, there was very meager instruction in chemistry and virtually none in physics. This being the state of things in the middle of the century, in institutions remarkably free from clerical control, it can be imagined what was the position of scientific instruction in smaller colleges and universities where theological considerations were entirely dominant. But in 1851, with the International Exhibition at London, began in Great Britain and America a movement in favor of scientific education. Men of wealth and public spirit began making contributions to them, and thus came the growth of a new system of instruction in which chemistry and physics took just rank. By far the most marked feature in this movement was seen in America, when, in 1857, Justin S. Morrill, a young member of Congress from Vermont, presented the project of a law endowing from the public lands a broad national system of colleges in which scientific and technical studies should be placed on an equality with studies in classical literature, one such college to be established in every state of the Union. The bill, though opposed mainly by representatives from the Southern states, where doctrinaire politics and orthodox theology were in strong alliance with negro slavery, was passed by both houses of Congress, but vetoed by President Buchanan, in whom the doctrinaire and orthodox spirit was incarnate. But Morrill persisted and again presented his bill, which was again carried in spite of the opposition of the Southern members, and again vetoed in 1859 by President Buchanan. Then came the Civil War, but Morrill and his associates did not despair of the Republic. In the midst of all the measures for putting vast armies into the field and for saving the Union from foreign interference as well as from domestic anarchy, they again passed the bill, and in 1862, in the darkest hour of the struggle for national existence, it became a law by the signature of President Lincoln. And here it should not be unrecorded that, while the vast majority of the supporters of the measure were laymen, most efficient service was rendered by a clergyman, the Rev. Dr. Amos Brown, born in New Hampshire, but at that time an instructor in a little village of New York. His ideas were embodied in the bill, and his efforts did much for its passage. Thus was established in every state of the American Union at least one institution in which scientific and technical studies were given equal rank with classical, and promoted by laboratories for research in physical and natural science. Of these institutions there are now nearly 50. All have proved valuable, and some of them, by the addition of splendid gifts from individuals and from the states in which they are situated, have been developed into great universities. Nor was this all. Many of the older universities and colleges thus received a powerful stimulus in the new direction. The great physical and chemical laboratories founded by gifts from public spirited individuals, as at Harvard, Yale, and Chicago, or by enlightened state legislators, as in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, California, Kansas, and Nebraska, have also become centers from which radiate influences favoring the unfettered search for truth as truth. This system has been long enough in operation to enable us to note in some degree its effects on religion, and these are certainly such as to relieve those who have feared that religion was necessarily bound up with the older instruction controlled by theology. While in Europe, by a natural reaction, the colleges under strict ecclesiastical control have sent forth the most powerful foes the Christian Church has ever known, of whom Voltaire and Diderot and Volney and Sainte-Beuve and Renan are types. No such effects have been noted in these newer institutions. While the theological way of looking at the university has steadily yielded, there has been no sign of any tendency towards irreligion. On the contrary, it is the testimony of those best acquainted with the American colleges and universities during the last 45 years that there has been in them a great gain, not only as regards morals, but as regards religion in its highest and best sense. The reason is not far to seek. Under the old American system the whole body of students at a university were confined to a single course, for which the majority cared little, and very many cared nothing, and as a result widespread idleness and dissipation were inevitable. Under the new system, presenting various courses, and especially courses in various sciences, appealing to different tastes and aims, the great majority of students are interested, and consequently indolence and dissipation have steadily diminished. Moreover, in the majority of American institutions of learning down to the middle of the century, the main reliance for the religious culture of students was in the perfunctory presentation of sectarian theology and the occasional stirring up of what were called revivals, which after a period of unhealthy stimulus inevitably left the main body of students in a state of religious and moral reaction and collapse. This method is now discredited, and in the more important American universities it has become impossible. Religious truth to secure the attention of the modern race of students in the better American institutions is presented not by sensation preachers, but by thoughtful, sober-minded scholars. Less and less avail sectarian arguments. More and more impressive becomes the presentation of fundamental religious truths. The result is that while young men care less and less for the great mass of petty, cut-and-dried sectarian formulas, they approach the deeper questions of religion with increasing reverence. While striking differences exist between the European universities and those of the United States, this at least may be said, that on both sides of the Atlantic the great majority of the leading institutions of learning are under the sway of enlightened public opinion as voiced mainly by laymen, and that, this being the case, the physical and natural sciences are henceforth likely to be developed normally, and without fear of being sterilized by theology or oppressed by ecclesiasticism. End of Chapter 12, From Magic to Chemistry and Physics, Section 2, and end of A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, Volume 1.